There is a kind of enemy that does not want you angry. It does not want you enraged, or bitter, or consumed by hatred, because those emotions are loud, and loud things get noticed. Loud things make you stop, reflect, and ask what is happening to you. What this enemy actually wants is something far quieter, far harder to catch, and far more effective. It wants you distracted. It wants your attention scattered across 100 tiny, meaningless things so that you never quite arrive at the one thing that matters. And decades before smartphones existed, before notifications buzzed in every pocket, before an entire industry was built on capturing your focus one scroll at a time, an Oxford professor sat down and imagined this exact strategy. He wasn't writing about technology, he was writing about the human soul. His name was C.S. Lewis, and what he wrote should unsettle you, because in a very real sense it was written about you. Lewis was not some fringe mystic or doom-obsessed preacher. He was one of the sharpest literary minds of the 20th century, a scholar at Oxford and later Cambridge, a man who had walked away from faith as a young atheist and only returned to it after years of arguing himself out of every excuse not to believe. He is the man who gave the world Narnia. But the book that concerns us here is stranger, sharper, and far less comforting than a wardrobe leading to a snowy forest. It is called the Screwtape Letters, and it takes the form of correspondence between a senior devil, Screwtape, and his nephew, a junior tempter named Wormwood, who has just been assigned his first human soul to corrupt. What makes the book so uncomfortable is not its fantasy. It is how mundane the advice turns out to be. Screwtape does not tell his nephew to tempt the young man into murder or theft or some dramatic collapse into evil. He tells him something far more practical and far more chilling. Don't bother with the big sins. Focus on the small distractions. Let the man drift. Here is where it gets uncomfortable, because if you strip away the demons and the fire and brimstone imagery, what Lewis is really describing is a theory of how people lose themselves without ever making a single dramatic decision to do so. Screwtape's advice to his nephew is built on one central insight. Humans do not usually fall because they choose evil in some grand, cinematic moment. They fall because they stop paying attention, they get busy, they get comfortable. They fill their days with errands, entertainment, minor irritations, and vague anxieties, and somewhere in all that noise, the part of them that might have noticed what was happening to their own soul simply falls asleep. The tempter's job, according to Screwtape, is not to create catastrophe. It is to manage a person's attention so carefully that catastrophe becomes unnecessary. Just keep the mind elsewhere. That's the whole strategy. Lewis describes this drift using an image that has outlived the book itself. The idea that the road to ruin is not a cliff you fall off in one terrifying moment, but a long, gentle, almost imperceptible slope. There are no dramatic turning points on this road. There is no single day where you can point and say, that is where it happened. Instead, there is a slow, soft decline, one so gradual that the person walking it barely feels the ground tilting beneath their feet. They are still going to work, still being polite to their family, still doing all the things that make a life look normal from the outside. But something essential has gone quiet inside them, and they didn't even notice it leave, because they were too busy checking one more notification, scrolling one more feed, refreshing one more page, distracting themselves from the very awareness that might have stopped the slide. This is the part of Lewis's insight that modern life has turned into an almost laboratory-perfect demonstration. Screwtape tells Wormwood that the safest and most effective temptations are the small, repeated ones that never rise to the level of a real decision. Don't give the man a reason to resist. Don't make him choose anything he'd have to justify to himself later. Just keep offering him a slightly easier, slightly more pleasant, slightly more numbing alternative to whatever difficult, meaningful thing he was about to do. Keep doing that. Meal after meal, hour after hour, year after year, and you will not need to tempt him into a single dramatic sin. You will simply have spent his entire life on nothing, one unnoticed minute at a time. He will look up one day, old and hollow, and wonder where all the years went. And the honest answer will be, they went into the noise you kept feeding him. It's worth pausing on when this book was actually written, because the timing makes the argument land even harder. Lewis composed the Screwtape letters in 1942, in the middle of the Second World War, while German bombs were falling on English cities and an entire generation lived under the daily, immediate threat of violent death. You might expect a wartime book about the human soul to be obsessed with fear, courage, or dramatic moral tests forced on people by falling bombs. Instead, Lewis spent most of the book on something almost embarrassingly ordinary. Bad moods at breakfast, boring church services, minor arguments between family members, the small satisfaction of feeling superior to someone else at a dinner party. Even with literal explosions outside the window, Lewis insisted the real spiritual danger for most people was not the bomb. It was the thousand small, unremarkable distractions of daily life that never stopped war or no war, and that most people never thought to examine at all. Now hold that thought for a second, because here's where Lewis's fictional demon starts sounding less like a fantasy character and more like a job description that actually exists today. Screwtape explains that one of the tempter's most reliable tools is what we might call attention management, keeping a person's mind constantly occupied with something, anything other than the present moment, other than their own conscience, other than the quiet space where real reflection or real prayer might happen. Silence is dangerous to the tempter's plan, because in silence people sometimes notice things about themselves they'd rather not notice. So the goal is to make sure silence almost never happens. Fill every gap, every waiting room, every red light, every walk to the mailbox, every moment before sleep. Fill it with something, so the person is never alone with their own thoughts long enough to ask the only questions that actually matter. What am I becoming? And is this the life I actually want? If that description makes you think of the phone sitting in your pocket right now, you are exactly where Lewis wanted you to be, even though he never lived to see a phone. He died in 1963, a full 4 decades before anyone had a supercomputer in their hand that buzzed every few minutes with a fresh little hit of novelty. But Lewis was not making predictions about gadgets. He was making an observation about human nature, and human nature apparently doesn't change much, because the exact mechanism he described in fiction has since been rebuilt, quite deliberately, as a business model. Engineers and designers spent years studying how variable rewards, unpredictable notifications, infinite scrolling feeds, and tiny dopamine hits keep people glued to a screen. They didn't set out to reenact a demon's correspondence from a 1940s novel. But that is functionally what they built. A machine whose entire purpose is to keep your attention anywhere except on the present moment, your own conscience, or the people actually sitting in the room with you. Here's what makes this darker than a simple complaint about screen time. Screwtape is very specific that dramatic vice is actually inefficient for his purposes, because dramatic vice tends to wake people up. A person who does something they consider truly terrible often feels a jolt of conscience strong enough to make them stop, reflect, and sometimes even change direction entirely. Guilt, in that sense, can be a kind of alarm bell, but low-grade distraction never rings any alarm. Nobody feels guilty for checking their phone one more time, for watching one more video, for scrolling 5 more minutes before bed. It feels harmless every single time you do it, which is precisely why it works. There is no moment of crisis to snap you out of it, because nothing about it looks like a crisis. It looks like relaxing. It looks like taking a break. It looks like absolutely nothing at all. And that is the entire point. Let's push this further, because there is a second layer to Lewis's argument that most people miss on a first read. Screwtape talks at length about something he calls the horror of the same old thing, describing how humans have an appetite for novelty that can be weaponized against them. People get bored easily. They crave the next new thing, the next new stimulation, the next small surprise. A good tempter, Screwtape explains, exploits that craving relentlessly, because a mind constantly chasing the next new sensation never settles long enough to build the kind of steady attention that real growth, real relationships, or real faith actually require. Depth requires staying with one thing. Distraction thrives on hopping to the next thing. And an economy of endless feeds, endless recommendations, and endless auto-playing videos is, whether anyone intended it this way or not, a perfect delivery system for exactly the kind of novelty-chasing Lewis's demon wanted to cultivate in his victim 80 years before any of it existed. The specific mechanism behind this is worth naming plainly, because it isn't mysterious anymore. Modern feeds are built on what's called a variable reward system, the same basic principle that makes slot machines compelling. You don't know exactly when the next interesting post, message, or video will appear, so you keep checking, again and again, chasing an unpredictable little hit of novelty that might or might not show up on any given refresh. Autoplay removes the natural stopping point that used to exist when a show ended or a record finished playing. Infinite scroll removes the bottom of the page, so there's never a natural place to pause and ask whether you actually meant to be here for the last 40 minutes. None of this was designed by a demon. It was designed by very smart, very well-paid people studying human psychology, and it produces, with unsettling precision, exactly the outcome Screwtape was hoping for: a mind that never quite settles, never quite finishes anything, and never quite notices how much of its life has quietly leaked away into someone else's growth metrics. Picture an ordinary version of this happening to an ordinary person. No dramatic villain required. She wakes up and checks her phone before she's even fully conscious. She scrolls through breakfast, only half hearing what her family says to her. At work, she opens 15 tabs and finishes none of them, jumping from task to task, never quite present with any single one. In the evening, she means to read, or call an old friend, or sit with the uneasy feeling she's been avoiding all week. But instead, she tells herself she'll just check one thing first, and 90 minutes disappear into a blur of videos she couldn't describe 5 minutes after watching them. Nothing about her day involved a single moral failure. She didn't lie, cheat, or hurt anyone. And yet, by the time she falls asleep, she has spent the entire day almost nowhere at all, present for none of it. And this is, according to Lewis's logic, precisely the kind of day the tempter would call a complete success. Now here's a rehook worth sitting with for a moment. What if the real danger was never a single vice at all, but the sheer accumulation of harmless seeming minutes? Lewis makes a point of showing that Screwtape doesn't care about winning any single battle. He cares about winning the war of attrition. It doesn't matter if the man occasionally prays, occasionally feels a pull towards something better, occasionally has a good, clear-headed day. What matters is the average. What matters is where his attention lands, minute after minute, across the thousands of ordinary hours that make up an ordinary life. A person doesn't need to commit some spectacular sin to end up empty. They just need to spend enough of those minutes on nothing, consistently enough, for long enough, and the emptiness builds itself, quietly, brick by brick, with the person's own unthinking cooperation. This is also why Lewis places so much emphasis on the small, domestic, almost embarrassingly petty irritations of daily life, rather than grand moral dilemmas. Screwtape spends real energy coaching his nephew on how to exploit family tension. The small resentments between people who live in the same house, the tone of voice a person uses with someone they love when they're tired, the self-pity that creeps in after a bad day, the grumbling about minor inconveniences. None of this looks like a spiritual battlefield from the outside. It looks like an ordinary Tuesday. But Lewis's argument is that the ordinary Tuesday is exactly where a soul is won or lost, because nobody is tested by imaginary villains in black cloaks. They are tested by traffic, by a sibling's comment at dinner, by a bad night's sleep, by the 40th petty irritation of the week, and by whether in the middle of all that noise, they can still choose patience, still choose attention, still choose to actually be present with the people in front of them instead of checked out, irritable, and elsewhere. This same mechanism quietly reshapes relationships long before anyone notices. Two people can share a table, a home, even a bed, while each of them is fully present with a screen and only partially present with each other. Nobody decides to stop loving anybody in these moments. Nobody has an argument about it, or even necessarily feels unhappy at the time. But presence, real presence, is made of thousands of small choices to actually look at someone, actually listen to the end of their sentence, actually notice the tired look on their face, instead of glancing past it toward whatever is glowing in your hand. Take enough of those small choices away, replace them with half attention, and a relationship can quietly hollow out over years without a single dramatic betrayal ever occurring. It simply erodes, the same way Screwtape always intended a soul to erode, not through catastrophe, but through the slow, comfortable accumulation of attention spent somewhere else. So what does the enemy actually want from you today? in your actual life, right now. Not your dramatic downfall, not some singular moment of moral collapse that makes for a good story later. It wants your today spent on nothing. It wants your attention parceled out in such small, constant fragments that you never once gather enough of it to notice what's happening, to sit with a hard feeling instead of numbing it, to have an uninterrupted conversation with someone you love, to pray or think or simply exist without also glancing sideways at a screen. Lewis's insight, dressed up in demons and letters, is really a very old spiritual observation, wearing a clever costume. The thing most likely to destroy a life is rarely a single catastrophe. It is usually just 1,000 tiny abandonments of attention, repeated until the person barely remembers what it felt like to focus on anything at all. There's a deeper piece of Lewis's thinking that connects directly to this. One he explored more fully outside the Screwtape letters, in his other writing on human nature. He describes people as a strange kind of creature caught between two worlds, partly spirit, partly animal, living simultaneously in eternity and in time, pulled at every moment between higher aims and immediate appetite. That tension, he argues, is not a flaw to be embarrassed about. It's simply the human condition, but it is also exactly the fault line an enemy would target if it wanted to derail someone without them noticing, because appetite is loud, immediate, and endlessly available, while the higher, quieter part of a person requires stillness, patience, and sustained attention to hear it all. Feed the appetite constantly enough, and the quieter part simply never gets a turn to speak, not because it was defeated in some battle, because it was never given the silence it needed to be heard. This is where Lewis's warning becomes almost prophetic, not because he predicted the specific shape of modern technology, but because he understood, with unusual clarity, exactly which lever a clever tempter would pull if it wanted to disable a human being as efficiently as possible without ever making them feel like anything was wrong. You don't need to convince someone to do evil. You just need to make sure they're never quiet enough, never still enough, never undistracted enough to notice that something in them has gone dim. Keep them comfortable, keep them entertained, keep them mildly irritated, mildly amused, mildly anxious, and mildly occupied all day, every day, and they will do the rest of the work themselves, walking calmly and willingly down that long, gentle slope, one convenient distraction at a time. There's another tool Screwtape recommends that deserves its own moment, because it explains something about the culture around serious ideas that still holds true today. Mockery. Screwtape suggests that one of the easiest ways to keep a person from taking their own soul seriously is to make sincerity itself feel embarrassing. Convince them that anyone who thinks deeply about meaning, mortality, faith, or self-examination is a bit much, a bit intense, a bit uncool. Surround them with a tone of constant irony and detachment where nothing is ever taken too seriously, and everything gets a joke instead of a genuine response. It's a brilliant strategy precisely because it doesn't argue against faith or depth directly. It just makes both feel socially awkward to bring up. And most people, given the choice between an uncomfortable truth and a comfortable joke, will reach for the joke every single time. An entire culture can be gently anesthetized this way, not through censorship, but through the simple, constant pressure to never be caught being too sincere about anything that actually matters. You can see a very modern version of this same tactic in how easily sincerity gets punished online. Say something genuinely vulnerable, genuinely hopeful, or genuinely serious about faith, purpose, or self-improvement in a public space, and you will often find a chorus of detached, ironic voices ready to mock it within minutes. Not because what you said was wrong, but because sincerity itself has become an easy target in a culture trained to reward cleverness over honesty. Lewis's demon would recognize this instantly. It costs nothing to make sincerity feel embarrassing, and once it does, most people quietly stop bothering with it in public, and eventually, without much effort at all, in private too. Put these pieces together, and a pattern starts to emerge that feels uncomfortably familiar. Keep people busy so they never sit still long enough to reflect. Keep them chasing novelty so they never build the patience depth requires. Keep them mildly irritated by the small domestic frictions of daily life, so their attention is always slightly used up on nothing. Keep sincerity feeling embarrassing, so even the people who sense something is missing are too self-conscious to say so out loud. None of these strategies require a single dramatic sin. None of them require a person to ever consciously choose to throw their life away. They simply require that person's attention to be occupied elsewhere, consistently, for years, until one day they look up from the noise and realize they have no idea where the time went, or who they were supposed to become, or what it even felt like to be fully present in their own life. So here's the twist buried at the center of Lewis's book, the one that flips the entire premise on its head, if you sit with it long enough. Screwtape is not actually afraid of a person's failures. He is afraid of their attention. The moments he warns Wormwood about most urgently are not moments of temptation successfully resisted through heroic willpower. They are the small, quiet moments when a person simply stops, notices something true, and pays attention to it without immediately reaching for a distraction to smooth the discomfort away. A single, honest moment of undivided attention, Lewis suggests, is worth more to a person's soul than years of busy, well-intentioned religious activity performed on autopilot. The enemy in this story is not fighting to make people do terrible things. It is fighting quietly and patiently to make sure they are never still enough, never attentive enough, and never present enough to notice what is actually happening inside their own life while there's still time to change it. Which brings the whole thing back around to you, sitting wherever you are right now, watching this. The question Lewis's book quietly hands you is not some abstract theological puzzle. It's a very personal one. Where has your attention actually gone this week? Not where you meant to put it, not where you'd claim it went if someone asked you at a dinner party, but where it really went, minute by minute, scroll by scroll, notification by notification. How many of those minutes were spent fully present with the people you love, fully engaged with the work that actually matters to you, fully awake to your own thoughts and conscience? And how many were spent in that soft, comfortable, endlessly available fog of minor distraction that never feels like a problem in the moment, and yet, added up across months and years, quietly becomes the whole story of a life? None of this means entertainment is evil, or that rest is a trap, or that every quiet evening scrolling through something mindless is a step down Lewis's gentle slope. Lewis himself enjoyed simple pleasures and never argued for some grim, joyless existence stripped of all comfort. The danger he described was never really about the individual distraction itself. It was about the accumulation, the pattern, the slow erosion of a person's capacity to ever be fully present at all, in anything, with anyone, including themselves. The fix, if his book points toward one, isn't punishing yourself for relaxing. It's noticing. It's building back the muscle of undivided attention on purpose, deliberately, in small doses, until silence stops feeling uncomfortable and starts feeling like the place where you actually get your life back. That might look like putting the phone in another room during dinner, not as a rule imposed on you, but as a small act of rebellion against the fog. It might look like sitting in silence for 10 minutes without reaching for anything to fill it, and simply noticing what surfaces when you stop drowning it out. It might look like actually finishing one book instead of half reading 5, actually finishing one conversation instead of checking a screen halfway through it, actually sitting with a hard feeling long enough to understand it instead of numbing it the second it appears. None of these are dramatic gestures. They will not make for an exciting story later. But according to the very logic Lewis laid out, that's exactly the point. The war for a person's soul was never going to be won or lost in some cinematic final battle. It was always going to be decided in 1,000 small, unremarkable moments of attention, chosen or squandered, one ordinary Tuesday at a time. So the next time you feel that small, familiar itch to check something, scroll something, refresh something, for no real reason at all, it might be worth pausing for just a second and asking what Lewis's demon would want you to do in that exact moment. He wouldn't want you to sin. He wouldn't want you to do anything dramatic enough to feel like a decision. He would simply want you to keep looking away, one more time, from whatever quiet, unglamorous present moment was sitting right in front of you, waiting patiently to be noticed. Lewis wrote that warning almost a century ago, in a world without a single smartphone, and it landed then because it wasn't really about technology at all. It was about you, about the shape of your attention, and about the very old, very human battle over where it finally comes to rest. The devil, if you want to use Lewis's language for it, was never especially interested in making you bad. He was interested in making you absent, and the only real defense anyone has ever had against that particular strategy is the simple, deliberate, repeated choice to actually show up fully For your own life, one undistracted moment at a time. Lewis never claimed to have the final word on any of this, and he'd probably be uncomfortable with anyone treating a piece of wartime fiction as some complete map of the spiritual life. But he was onto something that still holds up, decades after he wrote it, and long after the specific shape of the distraction changed from radio and gossip to algorithms and infinite feeds. The tempter's oldest trick was never really about lying to people or dragging them into obvious wrongdoing. It was about making sure they were never quiet enough, never attentive enough, and never present enough to notice their own life slipping past them while there was still time to do anything about it. That trick still works exactly as well today as it did in 1942, maybe better, because the tools available now are so much more sophisticated than anything Screwtape could have dreamed up for his nephew. Which means the answer Lewis pointed toward is also still exactly as available as it always was. Not a dramatic conversion, not some grand act of willpower performed once and never again. Just attention, reclaimed one ordinary moment at a time, starting with whatever moment you happen to be sitting in right now.